Hi folks, David Jameson here, editor at conter.co.uk. I'm just here for a wee chinwag about Andrew Neil's new vehicle, GB News, which launched a few days ago to the usual flurry of acrimony between the centre right and the centre left. I see that The Guardian gave it a 1-star review and so on, all a bit predictable. Obviously, it's a kind of stab at the sort of Fox News format, but here in Britain, after Andrew Neil was pushed out of the BBC, perhaps that's the way he'd put it, after 25 years. Though he's actually always had an eye on this kind of model. I think he tried to go for something like this with Fox News in the United States decades ago. But in any case, it's launched. It has a lot of glitches and a lot of problems. When I watched it, I found it very boring. There wasn't a lot of news in it. There was a lot of, debates about Britishness and fealty to the flag. A lot of talk about, metropolitan elites, all the stuff that by this point we are extremely familiar with, of course, from the culture war. And most of the retorts put back to Andrew Neil are in a similar vein, the usual kind of stuff. Oh, aren't you a metropolitan elite? We've heard all these arguments before, but I think what's more interesting is what's happened in the days since the launch, which is that a number of large and powerful and influential corporations in Britain have either pulled advertising or refused to advertise with the new platform because they say they disagree with its populist kind of right-wing ethos. It should be said, it's centre-right, basically. It's liberal Tory politics, but argued in that kind of antagonistic culture war kind of way, where these liberals are a problem and so on, and we need to stand up for the real people and their love of country and flag and all this kind of stuff. So it's not like it's foaming at the mouth reactionary stuff by any means. Andrew Neil is himself basically in the one nation conservative type mold. But what I found interesting about this was Andrew Neil retorted that all these companies like IKEA, they say they're all woke, but look how they treat their workers. It's very true. On Conter, we carried some stories last year around the time of the start of the pandemic about struggles in IKEA by workers to defend their access to sick pay, in this unprecedented situation. It tells you the kind of savagery that's gone on in IKEA and which has made its model successful. But what both Andrew Neil miss and his detractors, I think, miss in this whole framing is that there's nothing at all incompatible between being outraged at kind of flag-waving politics and cracking down on workers' rights. There's obviously no disjuncture between these sorts of things. There's no disjuncture between a symbolic politics of anti-racism or a symbolic politics of inclusion and being anti-working class and being a profitable corporation on the basis of repressing the rights and interests of your workforce, as all corporations do. Andrew Neil should know this, because this has always been his pet project in politics. And this is why attempts to paint him as this vulgar reactionary animal just fall short. When he was editor at the Sunday Times under Rupert Murdoch, where he really cut his teeth as a major media figure, he would clash with Rupert Murdoch on some of Murdoch's more socially conservative positions. As far as Andrew Neil was concerned, the radical free market project should move hand in hand with a move towards a kind of a radical individualism more generally. And this was always the kind of angle that he pushed in the paper. Now, it's a complex picture in the 1980s because people forget today that the way that neoliberalism was typically introduced in countries like the United States and Britain was that the conservative movement needed to leverage its liberal economic ideas with social conservatism. So Reagan in the United States used the moral majority movement, the kind of Christian fundamentalist or Christian evangelical anyway, movement to help, to build an alliance between those sorts of elements, some of whom were poor or middle class, and the kind of wealthy elements who had a clear, obvious material interest in advancing neoliberalism. In Britain, to an extent, there was a similar thing. Thatcher stole some of the language of movements like the National Front about Britain being swamped by immigrants and so on, at exactly the same time as she was pushing a liberalising agenda in the economy. So there was a traditional tension on the right to an extent, because what's going on with neoliberalism in the 80s and 90s, and to an extent before that in the 70s, is a major redistribution of wealth and a restructuring of society, which would undermine the living standards of particularly large sections of the working class, even some sections of the middle class. There's a major shake-up of society going on, and you probably need a degree of kind of popular, nationalistic, in some regards quite regressive attitudes to make that work in a lot of societies around the world, because you need to expand the base of support for the project far beyond a small number of economic elites. But in any case, in the long term, Andrew Neil's argument basically won out, that the way to consolidate neoliberalism, and this is what went on under Blair and Clinton, of course, the way you consolidated this revolution was to ally it with a radical individualist ethos, a radically socially pluralistic ethos, this famous ethos, which we all think of as baseline morality now, of I should be free to do whatever I want to do, so long as that freedom does not infringe upon the freedoms of other people to do stuff. That's become a kind of moral common sense, but it is actually an extremely liberal individualist conception of how you should morally organize a community. But that idea has won out. And the products, some of the products, and it's a complex picture because the decline of social conservatism in Britain has many tributaries. Some of them social movements, some of them economic developments, some of them demographic changes. But I think broadly you can say that very many of the things that the contemporary right complains about are basically the fruits of their revolution in the 80s and 1990s. So Andrew Neil is furious that IKEA, for example, that IKEA would rebut his kind of Tory-ish news platform on the basis that its ideas aren't woke enough, in Andrew Neil's phrase. He has a section on this GB News channel called Woke Watch, where he's going to be skewering all his enemies on this front. But this is his ideology in action. This is the combination of a moral basis in liberal individualism combined with an economic practice rooted in the marketization of society, the rise of these huge monopoly corporations, and so on. It's interesting to me that these people, Neil, Murdoch, Thatcher, Reagan, and many figures on the contemporary right, they forget that this process took place. It reminds me a lot of G.K. Chesterton, the right-wing philosopher, the conservative philosopher, who said, before you tear down a fence, you should know why it's there in the first place. I'm putting it less eloquently than him, but this was his broad argument. Because it's the fact that it's there implies that it's there for a reason. Now, obviously, I don't go along with the argument necessarily. Things can be there for bad reasons. But I sometimes do wonder if people like Neil, when he was destroying newsrooms, the traditional newsroom, he was a figure in the British. He tore the Scotsman apart, for example. He's part of the reason that here in Scotland, there's such a weak media culture, such a dilapidated media. He really set the model for that sort of stuff. He merged all the different departments. He cut out a great deal of creative freedom and quality control and all that kind of stuff, and cut large numbers of staff and so on. setting the pattern for decades to come in the situation we're in now. But, when he was ripping that stuff apart, and he was saying it was backward and it was dated and we need, a much more fleet of foot industry and all this kind of stuff, did he not think that those institutions had built up for any social purposes in society? Likewise, the unions that he helped to tear out of the industry and destroy, did he not think that they served any kind of social purpose? Did he not think that the print industry served a social purpose? One of many industries, the destruction of which was a prerequisite for the rise of that liberal individual culture. And now he sees the fruits of it. He sees that, the people resisting GB News are IKEA. He sees the fruits of it and doesn't recognize his own work in bringing this about. I think this is also a cautionary tale for the left, though, because here you have a right having torn down all the institutions that they once said were rotting and corroding British society, only to find, of course, as is the nature of desire, that the thing that they're ultimately left with, they don't want, and they're just as disappointed with it as with anything else. The right helped to tear down structures of communitarianism, also some structures of social conservatism. When you do that to society, it doesn't feel it has much of a need for religion anymore. It's not necessarily as attached to traditional ideas about the family. And we can have ambiguous attitudes about these institutions while still accepting that a major social transformation has taken place with severe consequences for society. So you now have a right who mourn, as they see it, the social and moral decline of society and the decline of traditional identities and the decline of traditional social roles and so on, themselves having helped to destroy these things. But all too often as well, you have a left who cling to the new vision. They cling to the I say new, it's now decades old, the orthodoxy of the contemporary society, that there's really nothing better than a society that focuses obsessively on a very narrow attitude about what's involved in individual freedom, consumer choice, the right to self-expression, the necessity of self-expression, the idea that the fundamental character of identity in modern society, that happiness comes from finding out who you really are, expressing who you really are, and so on. So there's a very, and of course the left had this idea foisted on us. We didn't choose it. By and large, some did, of course. Some were caught up in this general social change that was underway. But in any case, it doesn't account for what was lost in terms of power in the workplace. A mass working class movement with the power to change the course of society. So here we are, as it were, right and left, having completely switched places in certain respects, having this bogus war, with neither of us truly committed to the social objects we say we are, and at the same time, totally confused and obfuscated by the ideologies which have brought us to this juncture. So those are just some idle thoughts. Basically, I'm coming at you with no grand conclusions as such, except just a recommendation to take a couple of steps back from the spat between The Guardian and GB News and IKEA, and see it for what it is, which is a wrestle for position between elements of the elite where our interests aren't fundamentally represented. If you think that was interesting or think it was a total load of guff, please say so in the comments below, or send me a response at editor@conter.co.uk, and I will speak to you all again very soon.